all those who serve with them. We pray that thou would give them the strength as they continue to serve your people. We're thankful for the press who must convey to the people the need of obeying those who are set over them, the rules that are set out by our government. And we pray that as a people we will be obedient. We are thankful for the leaders of our land. And in every generation, you have chosen those who you need at an appointed time to lead the nation. And so you have appointed these who are in leadership today to take a stand. And we know the decisions that they have taken and will continue to take will create tremendous impact upon the lives and hearts of our people. But help them, O God, to listen to your voice and to stand up for that which is needed in this hour. I ask that thou assist us as leaders of the church to be obedient to the laws of the land and to stand up for righteousness, but also to stand up to give support to those who have to execute the laws. Bless us all, we pray now, and bless this conference, we ask. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you, sir.
We have been petitioned as well by several churches who would still want to conduct a National Day of Prayer. The challenge, of course, is that we would not be able to assemble in any large numbers, and therefore I'm certain that the technology does not take away from the sincerity of the prayer, and therefore we urge that as many prayer vigils can be held, but they would have to be done maintaining the gathering limits, and we could of course expand our audience by using the technology. The government of Jamaica committed to a special review of the Disaster Risk Management Enforcement Measures Order initially announced by me as Prime Minister on the 13th day of March 2020, and to generally keep under constant review all the measures announced and implemented. On Friday, March 20th, I put forward an additional order regarding the restrictions on persons coming into the country. Some people call it the closure of the airport, the closure of the borders, but that's not effectively what has happened. What we have actually done is to restrict incoming passenger. And I want to emphasize that cargo, either way, incoming or outgoing, is still permitted, indeed encouraged. We are not totally shutting down our economy. And as much as possible, we need to keep the economic engine more than truckling. You know, more, we might not be able to rev the economy, but we need to keep that engine going. And of course, persons who want to leave, particularly those who want to be repatriated, the airports are open for outgoing flights. But Jamaica is not at this time, except for the exemptions that may be in place, receiving incoming passengers. And you will understand that there may have to be exemptions, particularly for the maintenance of government, diplomatic relations, and those, but no general incoming passenger entry. And we have an order that is out, that is published. People should read it and understand what that order is saying. We now have 21 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the island. The Minister of Health will give further details. Would you want to do that now, Chris, to just give a detail on persons in quarantine, number of cases, that like, yep, let's.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. So the latest numbers are 21 confirmed cases of COVID-19. This is moving up from 19 when we last announced publicly.
Any doctors involved?
No doctors, no healthcare workers at this point. 14 are imported cases. 6 are imported related, so persons who picked up the virus from persons who have come in that we have been able to trace, and 1 is still under investigation. The increase comes as a result of what I said, 2 positives, and these positives are a 61-year-old from Manchester who has travel history that includes Florida, Dubai, Tanzania, and Egypt. So he could have picked it up from any of those countries. There's also a 51-year-old male with chronic illness from Westmoreland. He's a contact of 2 imported confirmed cases and was identified through contact tracing and admitted to a government quarantine facility. The gender of the current numbers are 13 males and 8 females. The average age, 48 years old, the youngest being a 24-year-old and the oldest a 79-year-old. The testing at the National Influenza Center continues. To date, we have had 21 positives, as said earlier. 19 tests have come back negative, and 4 tests are pending. And 51 persons are isolated in government facilities. Now, what this means is that we have a number of persons in a number of hospitals across the country. So a lot of our hospitals now actually have persons in isolation, under observation, and are being treated. The mandatory self-quarantine we had announced earlier in terms of the countries, but with a new announcement around travel restrictions for incoming passengers that would qualify for all persons coming in from countries that are affected, which now consist of most countries with community spread. The update on the 2 quarantine communities, Corn Peace Settlement, Hayes, Clarendon, the work continues there. The public health officials are doing their investigations. Residents are being monitored closely for signs of COVID-19, and we can give more details on that. 7 Miles, Bull Bay, we have done some 1,598 householders have been visited, over 2,600 persons have been interviewed, and we have had 1,700 sets of educational material that has been distributed across the community. And in the case of Bull Bay, we have another, is it 4 or 5 days? 4 days? 2 days. All right, so the 14-day period is going to be up in 2 days' time, and we'll speak more definitively about that. Remember now they were quarantined for 14 days, and the logical next step would be to discontinue the quarantine arrangements unless the clinical team find compelling reasons not to do so, but we'll comment on that later on. We are currently investigating 216 persons. Of that number, 29 have moderate to high exposure, meaning face-to-face or direct physical contact with a confirmed case. This is the Corn Peace Settlement now, while 180 were community members with the possibility of exposure. In terms of contact tracing, Ministry of Health through the parish health departments, 542 contacts across the island related to 21 confirmed cases. The last time we had a map here of where the confirmed cases were located, and we're doing contact tracing of persons across the country, numbering about 542. I'll remind members again about the airline flights that brought in persons who tested positive. JetBlue Flight 659, JetBlue Flight 2959, and JetBlue Flight B2893, which arrived on March 14th. The telephone numbers, of course, to reach us continue to be 8881-LOVE, that's 663-5683. And later on, after the Prime Minister comments, I'll give some additional information on some areas of emphasis that we'd like to approach over the next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. So we've categorized this epidemic into 4 phases in keeping with the categorization of the WHO. So we were in the phase of no cases a couple of days ago, a week or so ago, but we made provisions in that period of time. Then we had some sporadic cases, and we escalated the provisions to match that. Last week, at our press conference, we pointed out that we are now in the phase of clusters. We could identify clusters, so we could identify an initial case and trace from that initial case, and then you could identify the cluster geographically, and that would have helped us to determine what are the areas we would quarantine. And we have implemented quarantine measures, and I believe generally they have worked. There have been issues about providing food, people's ability to move around, and so forth. And those we are working out. It wasn't perfect, but I think it served the purpose of controlling and containing. I want to tell the nation now that we are rapidly approaching the phase of community transmission. The CMO I'd invite the CMO to explain what community transmission means and how we are going to prepare for that. Usually this is the period of time when you see an escalation in the number of cases, infections tested, and those clinically profiled. It is also the period of time when you might see increased panic in the population as the cases continue to rise. And we are making that estimation from the surveillance that the health team has conducted, but also from looking at what is happening regionally, that you are seeing countries' numbers rapidly moving. So we are preparing the Jamaican people for that. So far, we have managed it fairly well, and I don't want a sense of complacency to set in. From the measures that we have put in place, already we are seeing persons not taking them seriously. We see people flouting the rules. We ask that bars and certain establishments be closed, and people are still opening. We ask for social distancing. People are still neglecting that, believing that this will pass over us. I really need to emphasize to every single Jamaican that the greatest effort that we can make is our personal responsibility in following the recommended hygiene practices, the social distancing practices, the stay-at-home practices, and the quarantine practices. So I'm going to ask our CMO to give an overview of what is meant by community transmission.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so the Prime Minister outlined that WHO has moved to 4 phases of outbreaks. The first phase being no cases, the second phase being where they have sporadic cases. Sporadic cases mean a small number of cases, 1 or 2, that may be imported, and even if you have a link to another case, because of the small number, it is still considered sporadic. Then you have cluster of cases where you have a larger number of persons that are linked to an imported case. So right now, we have identified 3 clusters of cases. The next step is, and the final phase in the outbreak transmission is community transmission. What community transmission means is that you are now identifying within the community persons that you cannot link to an imported case or a contact with an imported case. So essentially what it means is that those persons that may have been undetected so far within the system in terms of persons coming into country and not being detected, or persons who may have traveled from areas of the country where you may have imported cases and gone to other areas of the countries, will now start popping up, and it is difficult to identify who it is that they are linked with. Now, once we start identifying cases like this in one part of the island, the assumption is that this is happening. That same process that resulted in that one person presenting is the same process that is happening across the island, and therefore we expect more will pop up. Now, it means that the country would expect at that time that we would start to see an increase in the number of cases, much more than we would be seeing before. As a result, the Ministry of Health and Wellness would increase, and we have already increased our surveillance to broaden the number of persons that we are testing, that we are identifying, and we're identifying the persons, we're testing them. Now, this has included that we are testing now all severe acute respiratory illnesses that are presenting to our hospitals. So all of these persons will be tested. Initially, we were testing only those that came from what we call our sentinel hospital, prescribed hospitals that we would expect to see a volume of these persons. And over the last week, we've tested 36 of these persons. These are persons from hospitals across the country that would have pneumonias, severe respiratory infections, and they have all been negative. So we are now going on to increase that testing to all hospitals that have severe acute respiratory infections. Those persons will be tested. Now, these are persons who do not have a link to somebody who came in with a case with COVID. They don't have a link with a confirmed case. This is just a sampling of the population to ensure that we are picking up cases that may be there. We are also going to be moving towards testing of persons that present to the Accident and Emergency Department and to other health centers. We are going to be testing those persons again who do not have a link to imported case, do not have a link to a case, to somebody who has traveled, but just a person that present with an influenza-like illness. And we are going to be sampling those persons to see if there is anybody out there so that we can detect where there may be community spread. Once we start testing like this, once we have community transmission, we will be able to identify right across the island where it is that cases are. In terms of our health system response to community transmission, we have already identified 316 beds in our hospitals, in wards that we have called our COVID wards, that we are preparing to admit persons who would need hospitalization. We have also are in a process of preparation of critical care bed spaces. For this, we have started our preparation in terms of procuring additional high-dependency unit beds, additional ventilators, additional suction machine, infusion pumps, all the paraphernalia that comes into high-dependency care. So we have started that process, and some of these equipment have already come in place. So in terms of our communications, it really is a matter that we really need to engage the public and encourage the public to become aware of their own vulnerabilities and to protect themselves by instituting infection prevention and control measures. Everybody would need to start being very responsible about this. Every single person needs to take a personal responsibility to protect themselves and to protect their loved ones.
Thank you, CMO. So my interpretation of what the CMO has said, and I am not a doctor, so I'm open to be corrected by medical experts, obviously, is that the probability of infection would be increased during a phase of community transmission. So any group of persons, the probability is that there probably would be one who could infect. In the other phases, the probability would be less because it's an imported case. You would have traced, you would have identified by virtue of your surveillance the clusters. Now you're saying that this could now be widespread in the population and we are about to discover it. It means, therefore, that this is the last press conference like this. It means that in any gathering at all, the probability has just risen. So we now have to institute measures to enforce on gatherings. We have to institute measures to protect the most susceptible, the most vulnerable to the disease. And these measures, I wouldn't say we agonize because we understand why we have to do them, but they do have implications for the continuation of normal life as we know it. But if you have not yet recognized that these are not normal times, then I encourage you to read more, pay attention to the news, and listen to what your neighbors are saying. If you don't believe in what the government is doing, then just look what all governments are doing around the world. It is a very serious situation. It is not a time for panic because panic does not help a serious situation. It is a time, however, for responsible action. The government cannot and is not expecting to be able to enforce on every single person who does not comply. But rest assured, the government will enforce on those who we catch. Because we cannot allow for one person who feels that they are immune to carry the COVID-19 disease and spread it all around. So we're going to take all the actions that we can within the law to protect the health of every single Jamaican as much as we can and as far as we can. So having said all of that, and the CMO has addressed the issue of testing, and I suspect there might be more questions about the shift in testing strategy based upon the phase that we are in. So, all persons 75 years and older must stay at home, subject to exemptions that are to be specified, and this will take effect on the 25th day of March 2020 for 14 days. I don't believe I need to explain it, but for the purpose of completeness, the established studies that have been done around it suggest that the susceptible group, the group that is most affected in a critical way, are our seniors, 65 years and above. So we are starting at 75 to ensure that those persons, 75 years and above, that they stay at home. And this will be starting on the 25th day of March. They will be allowed to conduct the essentials of life, but under certain restrictions, and those will be made known when the order is promulgated, and that will be done by the end of, well, by AG, help me, by tomorrow you'll have it? We'll have the order, yes, we'll have the order in place by tomorrow, so everyone will be able to read exactly the conditions under which. We have discussed the conditions, and in fact, that is part of the reason why we are a bit late. But in terms of drafting the order, that takes a little time, and we will do that tomorrow, but you have some notice. This is not a sentence at home, and I have persons who are family members, like everyone else, and this is not isolating them, locking them off. This is a little bit of social distancing, but it is not social isolation. All right? Still call them on the phone, go and look for them, carry food, make sure they're all right, keep engaging them. But remember that if you are young and healthy and you get the disease, the probability of you recovering is far greater than the probability of your grandparent or even your parent. And you may not even show symptoms. You may have a slight cold, as I say, and you recover, but you are transmitting. You are still carrying the disease, and you go and you hug up grandma, and poor grandma gets sick, and it was all because of you. So I'm urging all Jamaicans to observe this. I am not making it a recommendation. This is not no moral suasion, even though I've just done a little bit of moral suasion. We have placed it in the order covered by the Disaster Management Act. So there are penalties that can be put in place and enforcement can be done. All public sector workers, 65 years and older, are to work from home, subject to specified exemptions. Let me say that again. People might be saying 65 and older, you shouldn't be working. But there are many persons in the public sector who are on contract, some of them, and some of them engaged otherwise, doing all kinds of work in the public sector. They must now work from home. And the permanent secretaries are guided as to how they will implement that rule. That will take effect on the 25th day of March 2020. Schools are to remain closed from the ending of the last order to the end of the Easter term. And then during that period of time, again, we will advise if we will extend. So schools will remain closed until, remind me of the date, AG, I believe it's, well, there is a current order. So that current order expires in, I believe, Friday. Right, so that current order will continue until Friday, and then it will extend to the end of the Easter period, right? So effectively, schools will remain closed till the end of Easter. I think that's the easiest way to say it, but legally, how it is written, we have to follow that. Because there is a current order, that order has not expired. So when that order expires, then a new order kicks in to the end of the Easter term. Every person who entered Jamaica as at the 18th of March 2020 must be quarantined for a further 14 days after the initial 7 days expired. So, and that is a critical one, because there are many persons coming into Jamaica. Some of them don't have the virus. Anytime after that, let me just as information that would allow us to be able to track and trace, which is why we have made it a public duty for us that once we have discovered someone who is confirmed, we make a public notice that we have a confirmed case that came in on a particular flight, so that everyone on that flight can be aware. We ask you to make contact with the Ministry of Health so that we can know your health status, and then we ask you to quarantine. The Ministry of Health has limited resources, but a part of their surveillance will be to look at that manifest and do random checks to make sure that we don't have people who came in who are not observing the quarantine. And the quarantine laws are very serious. And we have established that where we find breaches, we will enforce. And I don't think I need to say anything more on enforcement. For a period of 14 days, with effect from the 25th of March, gatherings in any place shall not exceed 10 persons. So the original order, which is still in force, we said 20. But as we are moving into the community transmission phase, we have to cut the numbers that gather. And so now we are at 10. Other countries are down to 5 and 2. Right? We are still doing this balancing act of trying to keep the economy going and keep economic activity, because we recognize that if the economy goes, the very thing you're trying to address, you won't be able to address. And if you don't address the epidemic, then your economy goes. So it's a very difficult balancing situation, but I believe we are finding the right balance. So we are down to 10. This will be enforced strictly. So I believe we have covered, is there? Right, so I'll ask Minister Tufton to give some further details on what we have announced.
Thank you, Prime Minister. So in keeping with what the Chief Medical Officer said about community spread, we are also seeking to establish some facilities around the country. The public health infrastructure is divided into regional health authorities. There are 4 such regions, and we need to identify facilities, 600 rooms, and these rooms are rooms that have to have a bedroom with a bathroom. Okay, so it has to, so an individual can be relatively isolated or isolated. So we need 200 such rooms in Sarah, which is this region of Kingston, St. Andrew, St. Catherine, St. Thomas. We need 200 in southern region, which is Manchester, Clarendon, and St. Elizabeth. 100 in western, which is Hanover, St. James, Trelawney, and Westmoreland. And 100 in Nera, which is St. Anne, Portland, and St. Mary. These rooms, as I said, have to have their own bedroom and bathrooms. We are asking the public for support in helping us to identify these facilities. We know there are a number of facilities like hotels that are now not operating. The government would like to engage them in a conversation around the availability of these facilities. And of course, we'd like to engage them in a manner where we're not paying the normal market hotel rates in the national public. Lower rates, much lower rates. But it's important. And let me tell you why it's important. And CMO can expand on it if she feels I am not doing justice to it. When we have patients now that we have treated in the hospitals who are now recovering, they show no signs of illness. But when to release them, we have to achieve 2 negative tests. And that negative test has to be done within a certain period. Is it 48 hours apart or 48 hours apart? I'm learning. Until that time, you can't release them in the general population because they're classified as shedding. That's a terminology, meaning the virus is still active and can be spread. But in the meantime, we're holding them in an isolation ward in a hospital, which takes up space that others who are more critical could be placed in. So in a sense, what we're looking for is a transition house, if you will, halfway house, if you want to term it that would allow them to be isolated, to give them appropriate care while they recover. And the science is suggesting that this could take up to 30 days or less. And to have someone in a high intensity or intensive care unit for that period of time, we would just simply run out. So we really do need these facilities to give support for those who are transitioning from overcoming the worst to getting back to full normality. And again, we ask the public for support. The other point I want to make, with your permission, Prime Minister, is an appeal to the private practitioners or private doctors. Yesterday, we had a Zoom meeting with about 400 practitioners, many of them private operators, and we are appealing to them and to the rest of the country where private practitioners operate to avoid or be discouraged from shutting down your operation, because we're getting some of that. In other words, some private practices are closing shop, either because they feel they are not fully equipped to carry out their duties or have one concern or the other. We're saying that if you have an issue and you'd like us to engage you in conversation, we have the numbers. We're available for that type of conversation. And the reason being, to the extent that our private players, who see about 55% of our population on a normal basis, to the extent that they close, it creates a crowding effect on the hospital, which we really would like to avoid at this point in time. We're reaching out and we'll continue to do that. The third point is the rapid test kits, which I know persons are going to ask about. The testing mechanism, as explained by the Chief Medical Officer, is moving to another phase. I know that a number of Jamaicans have been inquiring, why is it that we can't get the rapid kits and be able to be tested as you feel you need to be? For starters, we would discourage that because we think it needs to be done under a controlled setting. Secondly, there are many offers of kits out there, and the reliability of a number of those offers are questionable. And we are very careful to examine to determine that we have a kit that gives a high level of accuracy. We have appointed a small team, and they have come back with a recommendation. And I think we're now at the phase where we can acquire these kits and establish a protocol that will allow approved entities, more than likely to be our public health system, hospitals in the parishes or selected parishes, to administer the test, except that that protocol in the first instance, where someone is positive, would mean a secondary test with the more accurate arrangements that we have at the influenza center. So the answer to the rapid test kits is that hopefully within a relatively short space of time, I'd say a few weeks or so, we should be able to offer that. And the final thing I want to mention is just the issue of stigma. I really want to appeal to the public to adjust their minds to the reality of COVID-19 and to place yourself in the context of a year from now. Not a prophet, but I'm prepared to say that COVID-19 would be no different from H1N1 or some other form of influenza. In other words, people are going to get it or avoid it with a vaccine or treat it if they have it, and life will go back to normality. Right now, it is being treated as leprosy or something that you have to run away from, not just from getting it, which we appreciate, but run away from people who might have it or you suspect have it, to the point where persons are being abusive and even threatening. And it really is not the approach that we would like to adopt. We want you to be concerned, but we don't want you to treat people as outcasts because you suspect that they have it. And we're going to be doing some work to communicate a better appreciation and understanding for the virus, the disease, and to hopefully get Jamaicans to adjust their thinking to supporting those who they think may be infected while remaining cautious in terms of our approach and accepting it as the new norm, which over time it will become, except with much better ways to dealing with it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Minister. A couple of things to clarify before I take questions. And Minister Mackenzie to make a brief presentation. The requirement for work at home, stay at home, work at home, that was in the last order, that stands and that is also extended for another 14 days as of the 25th. So it would apply for persons home and they are in the public sector and they perform what would be considered an essential function, such as a doctor or a nurse. When the order is written, you will see the various exemptions that are made. So there's a reason why we have to do it this way, because we want to give you advance notice, but pay attention to the order itself that comes out, because it is now not just by me saying it here, it is now by law. So the order comes out. We'll try to have it out by midday tomorrow. AG, put you under some pressure. But let's have it out as early as possible. Minister Mackenzie.
Thank you, Prime Minister, colleagues, members of the media. Today, I had a video conference with all the mayors and CEOs across the country. Following that meeting and a report received from the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management, ODPEM, the Ministry of Local Government has established a special series of policy programs and measures which we intend to institute. The objectives of the ministry is to secure the integrity of the vulnerable in the population in our infirmaries, as well as those who interact with them. Protect the indoor poor, those who are on the poor relief list, as well as the outdoor poor. Accordingly, I wish to announce the following measures which I've given to the Most Honorable Prime Minister in writing this afternoon. The ban that was placed on the visits to infirmaries have now been moved from the original date, which was 14 days, to now 60 days. I should say to 30 days, and the ban on new admissions have been pushed to 60 days. We are now moving also to establish, as I mentioned in the first week, isolation areas which are fully advanced as I speak, and to make available at the Vineyard Town Golden Age Home and the Clarendon Infirmaries some 30-odd rooms to facilitate social cases from our public hospitals. The ban on amusement license will be in force for an additional period, and also the opening and closing of markets, the hours will remain from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. Additionally, a ban will be placed on the operation of barbers and hairdressers, and the details will be announced when that order is made tomorrow. There are some initiatives that the government is putting in place to protect the vulnerable population which exists in the country, in our infirmaries. And I'd just like to quickly outline some of these protocols that will come in effect immediately. A special sanitization protocol has been established at all our facilities where employees and service providers are required to go through the necessary security checks and have special screening done before they enter these facilities. Beginning on Monday the 30th, a special sanitation program involving all infirmaries and golden age homes will be implemented over 3 days, concluding on April 3rd. This will be a collaboration between the municipal corporations, the Jamaica Fire Brigade, the Jamaica Defense Force, and the National Solid Waste Management Authority, and the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management, ODPEM, and the Municipal Corporation. An additional 100 new jobs will be provided in helping to secure our infirmaries and golden age homes across the country. We have not forgotten, ladies and gentlemen, the outdoor poor, which number some 14,000 across the country, and especially with an age group of 60 and over. The Poor Relief Department will be distributing care packages to meet the needs of all these areas, and this program will last for a period of 3 months, commencing on March the 30th. Also, there is 3,000 students who falls under the portfolio of the Poor Relief Department that will receive lunch on a daily basis. Concerns have been raised about the government's response to persons living on the streets across the country. There's over 2,000 Jamaicans that lives on the street, with the corporate area housing at least 80% of those persons. With immediate effect, the local authorities will be providing care packages on a daily basis for all persons living on the streets across the country. We will provide facilities at our drop-in centers. Each parish is equipped with drop-in facilities where we will take these people to these facilities, working with the Ministry of Health to do the necessary checks to see whether or not they are affected. And we will be providing for them over the next 4 to 6 weeks on a daily basis a care package along with at least 2 meals on a daily basis. Last matter I want to mention is the question of water. The municipal corporation will be moving to provide water to parishes which are affected by severe drought conditions, and will ensure that all our facilities across the country have adequate water, and communities which is in need of this commodity will be in receipt of it. Just to tell you that over 30,000 persons fall under the direct control of the Poor Relief Department in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you. I noticed when you said barbers and hairdressers, there was a stir in the room. I did not hear that stir when we said markets and supermarkets. Just to clarify, it's not a ban, it's a restriction. And of course, the restriction, I think it's pretty mild, which is it will be a restriction on opening and closing hours, which will be determined in the order when it is published. And in particular, it will fall under the general gathering restriction, no more than 10, but there will be an additional restriction that there should be no more than 2 persons waiting, because what we don't want the crowded salon or the crowded barbershop. So rest assured, rest at ease. I think we've covered most, so if there are questions.
Thank you so much for that clarification, Mr. Prime Minister and ministers. And now we'll take your questions. We repeat this all the time, but those who are here know, please raise your hand. Once you have a question, we'll give you the mic. Please identify yourself and ask your question succinctly. I think Mrs. Miller has one. Could you pass this microphone over?
Dion Jacks Melo, RGR TVJ. There's been back and forth with regard to the personal protective gear equipment for health workers. And we keep hearing from them, they're not satisfied. We're hearing from the government that there's adequate PPE. I'd just like to get a little bit more granular if we could, because when we talk about PPE, we keep hearing references to gloves, masks, and gowns. What about eye protection, face shields, and hazmat suits? What's the inventory level in relation to those items, and who is wearing them? In addition, one patient, as we know, died where the health professionals who treated him wearing hazmat suits, and if not, why? And do all the regional hospitals and indeed any facility with an isolation unit have hazmat suits for their professionals?
You just eliminated me from answering that question. Let me ask the CMO to come and deal with it.
Okay, so personal protective equipment includes gloves, gowns, coveralls. In terms of mask, you have surgical mask, you have N95 mask. In terms of eye protection, you have goggles and you have face shields. What is required is dependent on where you're functioning as a healthcare worker. So the highest level of protection are going to be used in situations where we have the risk of particles being aerosolized. So there are procedures that are carried out, for example, the intubation of a patient, that is where you put an airway down into a patient's respiratory passages. You will have certain procedures that are carried out in the intensive care unit and in high dependency areas, such as suctioning, where the particles that are there become mixed with air and get a little pressure from the procedure and are launched into the air. Those procedures require the highest level of personal protective equipment, including, in some situations, coveralls, N95 mask, goggles, and or face shields. Those equipment, yes, are to be provided in intensive care units, just in case, even if you don't have a patient who have them. Now, from the time of Ebola, we have supplied all our hospitals, all our health departments, all the RHAs with these types of equipment. I can personally tell you that we have supplies in head office at the Ministry of Health and Wellness. So if it is that there is any challenge that persons are facing, then I expect that it would be dealt with by the health department, by the regional health authority, and if necessary, by the Ministry of Health and Wellness. In terms of the other supplies that are being used for persons who are managing persons who are, for example, in an isolation setting, which is not a HDU, not a high dependency, or not an intensive care setting, that would include a water-resistant gown, gloves, and a surgical mask. These are widely available within our health facilities. Depending on the level of contact, say for example, in a primary care facility or in a triage or accident and emergency department setting, then either a surgical mask may be required, or depending on how the patient is presenting, the types of symptoms they have, then of course a fluid-resistant gown may be appropriate as well, along with gloves. I'm trying to see if I'm skipping out any procedures. I just want to mention that in conducting the test, the swabbing, there is the risk that you may aerosolize particles, and especially if you put the swabs in and persons tend to gag. So we have recommended that persons who are doing the swabbing use an N95 mask. And of course, I would expect that they would put on a fluid-resistant gown as well as gloves. Eye protection, of course, if they are coming into close contact with the person. For that kind of procedure, of course, would include a face shield. So these items, I just want to reiterate, are available within the public sector. We have orders for more equipment. I do understand, because I hear it every day as well, that persons are saying that they don't have these things, okay? Now, there is always the dilemma where persons believe that they need more than is required for a procedure. For example, somebody who is working in a triage area may believe that they need to have gowns or coveralls or a N95 mask. It is not necessary in those situations. In the situations that the equipment, the particular pieces of equipment are necessary, then they are provided. But we are willing at the ministry to address the concerns of the healthcare professionals so that they will feel comfortable dealing with the cases that they have to deal with in front of them on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you, CMO. It is now 7:58. I know there are several questions. And also, Prime Minister, this is the greatest public health emergency we've faced in our lifetime. There are so many people on social media who do have a few, so we will be able to allay fears. May I recognize Mr. From the Gleaner, I beg your pardon.
Thank you. Edmund Campbell, Gleaner Company. Last week at the press conference, a graph was presented showing that patient 1 started showing symptoms of the virus on March 7. But of note is that though patient 5 were showing symptoms on March 3 and patient 6 began showing symptoms on March 1. Just a couple of questions here. In which parishes were these patients over the period they were displaying symptoms before finally being diagnosed with COVID? That's 1. 2, when were they tested? How long after March 3, when patient 5 began showing symptoms, did he or she visit a doctor? How long after March 1, when patient 6 began showing symptoms, did he or she visit a doctor? And the final question is, were all protocols followed when patient 5 and 6 visited the doctor? Thank you.
Can we recognize another
persons who are asymptomatic? Are we now in a position to begin testing persons who are asymptomatic?
As it is right now, we are reviewing our testing protocols. We have reviewed so far to include that all persons with severe acute respiratory infections will be tested. We have included so far to include that healthcare workers who present with influenza-like illness will be tested. We have included that all contacts that are traced that are found to be symptomatic, whether they are close or casual contacts, will be tested. Now, there are going to be particular situations that will arise that will stimulate a testing protocol that is going to be directed have more targeted testing. So I can say that every day we review, we look at what we have available to us, and we see how best it is that we meet the requirements that are being provided, that are being requested of us. But the testing is important for us to recognize that when we start going into wholesale testing, what it is that we're trying to determine is where in the island we have affected cases, so that we can target our response to those areas. So in terms of the sampling that we are doing, in terms of the healthcare workers, the severe acute respiratory infections, and the persons that are coming into our accident emergency departments and primary care facilities, we are reasonably confident at this time that if this is carried out, that we would be able to detect areas where there are community spread and be able to target our interventions. I just want to emphasize that a confirmatory test is not needed for treatment of a patient. Okay, patients with COVID-19 right now are being treated symptomatically. And I would just want to mention at this time as well that the ministry is investigating treatment options that have been used in other jurisdictions. We are looking at those closely, and we are about to make our own recommendations in terms of getting in supplies to do some of that testing, some of that treatment, okay?
Thank you, CMO. Ms. Chisholm at the back.
Thank you very much. I'm not standing because I don't want to interrupt the camera feed around here. Just a few quick issues. Can you please provide an update on at least patient 1 and 2? Have you been able to determine how the 60-year-old female from Portland contracted the virus? And you indicated that one of the confirmed cases was still under investigation. Can you say which? And at the last press conference, PM, you mentioned that there would be increased emphasis on elderly persons and those with pre-existing conditions. We heard about the elderly persons today. Any special provisions for those with pre-existing conditions?
Thank you, Andrea.
Okay. In terms of patient 1 and 2, patient 1 and 2 are doing well, have remained asymptomatic. I'm not sure of the exact amount of days at this present time that they have been asymptomatic, but we have started discharge testing for these persons. So discharge testing means that we will do, once they have been asymptomatic for 2 days, we would do a repeat test. If that test is negative, then we would repeat in 2 days' time. Once we have 2 consecutive negative tests, then we would discharge. So far, our discharge testing for those persons have remained positive, but they remain asymptomatic. So we will wait again to retest again. The 60-year-old female that you mentioned in Portland, that is the case that we have said that still remains under investigation. The individual remains in the community, in close enough surroundings to an area that was visited by another confirmed case. Now, we are still doing our investigations in terms of identifying contacts who have symptoms, and we have started some preliminary testing in that area. However, we believe that she represents a part of a cluster associated with a confirmed case. But we have not had that direct association as yet to say that this was the person that she got it from. But there are several areas that are still being explored how that was possible. Okay.
Thank you, CMO. Pardon me? The pre-existing?
What was it?
Those are captured in the restrictions for homework.
Well, I suspect you're saying the vulnerable group. So I think Minister of Local Government, in treating with persons who are indigent, persons who are in state care and out of state care, that's the real vulnerable group. And the government has really looked across the field, and we have tried to put in place measures for those who are poor and indigent, those who are in state care, particularly golden age homes. The Minister of Local Government has given those measures.
Prime Minister, ministers, and officials, I am aware there are other questions here. You have said you would take a few from social media, two very interesting ones for you. With the U.S. Representative Senator Rand Paul being confirmed as having COVID-19 and having interacted with others in the U.S., what is the plan for Parliament convening with less than 10? And I have one as well from social media to Dr. Bisesa McKenzie concerning the vulnerability of pregnant women especially.
You want to take the pregnant woman first?
There has been one study that I'm aware of that looked at a series of pregnant women in China. And that study had investigated both the mother and the baby and the amniotic fluid, and all of those tested, all the tests were done, and it showed that there was no evidence of mother-to-child transmission. I am aware that there is one other case report that speaks about a child having gotten the virus, having tested positive, with the mother being tested positive. However, there was nothing to suggest that it was a mother-to-child in utero transmission, and that the baby could have gotten it from the mom, just being in close contact with the mom after birth. So at this time, I have no evidence to suggest that there is a danger of a mother-to-child transmission in utero. But of course, I would want to say that pregnant mothers remain part of our vulnerable group of persons, and therefore every precaution should be taken to prevent them from getting ill.
And Parliament, sir?
Yeah, as it relates to Parliament, you can imagine the discussions that were held in Cabinet today in coming up with the restrictions. Because the restrictions, if they were to be widely enforced, would mean that there are some members of Parliament who would not be able to attend Parliament. But we also looked at it from the perspective of the constitutional duty of the elected representative to be in Parliament. And could we really restrict a member of Parliament from going to Parliament? What we said is that given the phase that we are about to enter in, we have to take great precautions. So the member of Parliament has a duty to both protect themselves from people who may have the virus or don't unduly expose themselves to the virus. And if they themselves have it, they shouldn't expose members. Now, that's an honor system that, we're hoping that will be maintained. But the truth is that the leadership of the country must be intact and must be present, functional and operational. We could not interfere with the democratic process. So the Cabinet has to continue and the Parliament has to continue. We can't put any laws that would interfere with that, but I'm certain that the political parties that form the sides in Parliament will have to meet to figure out how they ensure that, one, there is social distancing, but of course the majority and the minority is maintained, that if votes have to be taken, there is enough votes present in the Parliament. In other words, the Parliament continues to function. What the Cabinet has decided is that we will have a quorum, and then those who don't have to be in Cabinet will be able to participate remotely. In fact, you know we have recently transitioned to a digital cabinet. So last week and today, everybody was set up on a particular remote workspace technology. So it is possible that we will have the quorum, and those who are at home can, via the internet, connect in and participate and have their participation recorded. So yes, there is an exemption for Parliament and Cabinet.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. It is 12 minutes past 8 o'clock. I will ask CVM, who is on the other side.
Just, if I may, please,
Minister,
just
yes.
to add in terms of some of the rules of engagement and also further update and information from the parliamentary standpoint. The Honorable Carl Samuda had, in his capacity as leader of the House, appointed a parliamentary committee comprising of the following persons: myself as chair, AG Marlene Malahou Fort, Dr. Norman Dunn, Mrs. Juliet Holness, Mrs. Marissa Dalrymple Filbert, Dr. Morris Guy, Mr. Mark Golding, Mr. Horace Daly, and Dr. Angela Brown Burke. And this special select committee will coordinate and oversee the COVID-19 response. And as chairman, I have called the first meeting for 10 a.m. tomorrow in the Parliament, and we'll discuss, among other things, some of the rules of engagement in the protection of the parliamentarians, but also in ensuring, too, that the business of the country continues.
All right, just to add to what Minister Tufton said, that you will recall when we had our first press conference, we gave a commitment that we will have a bipartisan committee to look at the administration of the COVID response. That is the committee just announced. But more importantly, another landmark in our Parliament, that we have we have amended the standing orders to allow for the meeting to happen remotely. So your first meeting will be in Parliament, but the other meetings will happen remotely.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Again, I'm just giving a timestamp. It is 14 minutes past 8 o'clock. Let's go to CVM on the other side, please.
Thank you very much.
Right. So maybe I should do a wrap-up, but I see...
CVM had a question, sir. So I'm giving everybody a chance to at least ask a question before we go to any follow-ups, and it is 8:15.
Okay, sure.
CVM?
Yes, Mr. Prime Minister, Michelle Thomas. On the matter of enforcement of the law, I think at a previous press conference, you had announced that the Attorney General's chambers and the Ministry of Justice would have been reviewing the penalty provisions in some of the legislation. Can you update us as to whether an amendment has been done and whether that's ready for Parliament to review? And as well, just to add to that, there were reports of some arrests today in following breaches. Are these the first such breaches, or are there reports of other persons who have run afoul of the order?
So I gave directives for the laws that have to do with the emergency management. Those are being done now. The Minister of Justice and the Attorney General are reviewing. In fact, I sent a document to the Minister of Justice and the AG this morning, and they are reviewing those. We were hoping we could get it done, but given the volume of things that we have to do, yes. But we're gonna upgrade those penalties in the various acts under the Public Health Act and so forth. But the Disaster Risk Management Act also gives us significant powers of control, and we will be conducting most of our response under that act. But we will upgrade the penalties as well under the Public Health Act. Remind me of your second question, which was?
Have there been any other arrests outside of the ones announced by the Jamaica
Let me say that arrest is the last thing I want to do. As I stand here, I don't, I'm actually disappointed that as a country we have to turn to arrest. I'm very, very disappointed. But I would not be fulfilling my job as leader of the country if I were to allow any form of indiscipline to be rewarded by not facing the consequence of the law. especially in this time of emergency. So there have been, so far, I've seen 2 arrests. I'm sure the police may have had others which were not publicized, but they have been mobilized to treat with this matter very seriously.
And the final question to the CMO, as it relates to the expanded testing regime, can you just clarify across public hospitals, when is that to begin, and do you have capacity to do that?
Yes, we currently do have capacity to begin this, and we have already started.
Thank you. Our final question then this evening, Mrs. Miller, I think Prime Minister had acknowledged that you had a follow-up. If you could, please. Oh, sure.
Many thanks. Given what's likely to be the economic impact of COVID-19 on our economy, Mr. Prime Minister, can you say if Jamaica is one of the countries that the IMF says has already reached out to it for possible assistance? Also, CMO, you hadn't answered my questions in terms of inventory levels. I mean, we can say we have something, and it's 2 of it we have. So can you give us an idea what are the inventory levels, and also in relation to the gentleman who died, whether he was being treated by health professionals wearing hazmat suits? And just finally, my colleague from Nationwide on Friday asked a question that wasn't answered. I'm going to repeat it and ask, are you doing modeling or projections to show what is likely to happen with the spread of this disease in the next few weeks? And if so, what is that showing? Thank you.
My answers are fairly short. Firstly, the Minister of Finance has given an indication of what the package would look like in terms of our economic response to the epidemic. He will address tomorrow the nation in the closing of the budget, and he will give further details. As it relates to Jamaica reaching out to the IMF, I will allow the Minister of Finance to address those issues, and I'll leave it at that. I won't say any further. I'll allow the Minister of Finance in his presentation tomorrow to address those issues.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so much. Ministers, thank you. I know there are several other questions. I think the CMO will do a follow-up to Dion's final questions. Until then.
I will do just a run-through of everything.
We thank you. All right, Prime Minister.
Right.
CMO?
So in terms of the inventory list, I'm not going to have the numbers on me, but we can supply you with that. In terms of the person that was at Mandeville Hospital, he was not being managed in the intensive care unit. He was being managed in the isolation unit, and so therefore the necessary PPEs were being worn. The projections have been presented at several meetings before, but we can provide that as well to you.
I would, well, I mean, as it relates to, you've asked a question about modeling. Right, so I'm not going to pretend to be able to answer the question, but I think there's a context that is important. The Ministry of Health provided the National Disaster Risk Management Council with what I thought was a very good exposition on the threat facing Jamaica. They presented several risk scenarios, which would include numbers of infections and the mobilization in terms of resources from the budget, resources that already exist that would have to be repurposed, and any potential gaps that would exist. So my view, based upon seeing that, is that they would have had to use some modeling to get to that, because it was pretty granular in terms of what they presented to us. That helped to inform our response, particularly from the budget side of things. So yes, my response to that would be yes, there is modeling that took place to support the response. CMO, if you'd want to just give.
No, I just want to say that we will provide, Stephen could provide that, the modeling that we did for you. The numbers. It includes the numbers of hospitalizations, the number of severe cases.
Thank you, CMO. And to be very, very clear as well, for the questions that have not been answered, given that we need some detail.
Just to be clear on the modeling and the numbers, we did not publicly release the numbers, the modeling that was. I think at this stage, we could. You released? No, it was in here, but it wasn't public release. So the issue is, once we release the numbers, you know, we hope that people will take it for what it is. It is a projection, it is a model, and that it's not turned into the regular grinder of, you know, this is what the government said would happen, because what happens might be quite different from what we project. But we will release the modeling that informed the government's response. So if I'm allowed to just do a very quick run through, just so that we're clear, we are now in the phase, well, we are close to now being in the phase. We are anticipating that we're going to be entering the phase of community transmission. We're not saying we're there yet, but we're very close to being there. And in that phase, the numbers could rise, they could spike, they could rise exponentially. Questions were asked about the government's resources and capacity. The CMO's response is that we have supplies and capacity appropriate to a certain level. For all countries, even the richest countries, their resources are being placed under threat and strain depending on the level of the rise in infections. Our strategy from day one, when we had no cases, was to stay on the flatter curve. And we have put in place measures appropriate to the time and phase that we are in to keep us on a flatter curve, on a lower trajectory. But once we transition into community transition, that's a whole different ball game, and it's very difficult to say what is going to happen. Bearing that in mind, we are seeking to reduce the probability of spread, and we have put in place certain measures. First measure being that if you are 75 years of age and over, that you must stay at home. Of course, provisions and certain exceptions will be made for the continuation of the essentials of life. Those will be clearly identified in the order which we will publish tomorrow. But what you need to bear in mind, if you're 75 years and older, stay at home. If you are 65 and older and you work with the public sector through the permanent secretaries have been directed now by virtue of this to ensure that you work at home. However, again, there are some exceptions that will be made, and those will be published in the order, and we can say that we do have medical doctors who are 65 probably working in the public sector, and we will, and some nurses as well, and we will make provisions for those. Those are essential. If you are in the private sector, so let me just be clear. If you are in the private sector and you are happening to work at 75, you must stay at home. There's no exception. If you are 65 and you are working in the private sector, if your employer, by virtue of their good conscience, sees it necessary, and we encourage them to follow the government's lead in this, arrange it such that you can work from home. All right? We don't want to shut down the country. I see somebody saying we should put it to 60. All right, I will. So let me run through, and then we'll ask Minister of Health to look at pre-existing conditions. The pre-existing conditions were really matched with age. That were really matched with age. I don't think we make special provision for pre-existing conditions by themselves. But the Minister of Health may have some other perspectives, right? So you just threw me off there a little bit. Right, so I was at the school term. I hope I've clarified everything as it relates to the age staying at home. In terms of the schools will remain closed to the end of the first order, which would have been on Friday, and then they will remain closed after that to the end of the Easter term. Just before the Easter term, we will give enough notice if there needs to be a continuation. The stay-at-home order that was given previously, or rather work-from-home order that was given previously, that remains in place. So, and will be extended again for another 14 days, and that will be in the new order that is published. Every person who entered Jamaica as at the 18th of March 2020 must be in quarantine for a further 14 days after the initial 7 days expired. So if you came in on the 18th, you should be in quarantine already. But we know that there are many Jamaicans who came in and did not go into quarantine. By this order, you must go into quarantine. And just to be clear, we will be scrubbing through the manifest, and where we can identify addresses, we will be doing sample checks and enforcing. Very important, because we need to be able to identify the cases that have been imported into the island so that we can start to trace around them and determine clusters for containment. And for a period of 14 days, again, with effect from the 25th of March, all gatherings are now at 10. The previous order was 20, now we are at 10. And this one has to be strictly enforced. All the other entities that were declared or required to close, those still remain so, as the Minister of Local Government had pointed out. We have now added to the list of restricted entities the barber shops. We will set a time for them to open and close. That will be in the order tomorrow. And that they should not have more than 2 persons waiting. Remember now, in the space. So remember, they are still subject to the social distancing. They are still subject to having 10 persons, but they must not have more than 2 waiting. So if you have a big barber establishment, right, you have to count the barbers. So if you have 4 barbers, then that's 4 out of the 10. That means you have 4 chairs. So that's another 4 out of the 10. 8, and only 2 can be there waiting, and that's your 10. With enough spacing. So I hope I have explained it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, ministers, and all the officials here this evening. That concludes our briefing this evening. Please, for those who are on social media with questions, we've seen some of those. The Prime Minister tomorrow will host a digital briefing for children, a digital briefing for children. So you can check out, of course, the Prime Minister's social media pages, the JIS website, OPM's website. We will stream live starting at 12:30 tomorrow, a digital briefing where children can ask the Prime Minister questions on this issue of COVID-19 and how Jamaica is dealing with it. We thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please join us again.